So here I have a visual model of a remote control, and I have an actual picture from a Google search of the LG Magic, and we're going to be trying to create a render that's somewhat similar or fairly close to what this looks like. Probably won't be exact, but I'll take you through the process that I would go through for setting up this entire render. So typically while modeling, I will have already selected a primary color or primary appearance to go off of, but in this case I decided to remove all of the appearances out so I can go through the selection process from start to finish. So first I want to bring up my preview window, and once again, if you haven't watched any of the other videos, or if you don't remember, I always set the preview to good quality so that it regenerates quickly. Especially with a model that's as simple as this, I can create a final render fairly quickly, so I'm not too worried about the preview being exact because I can try out several final renders. So if you look at that picture that I brought up, the obvious choice that would come to mind would be using a high gloss plastic and choosing the black color. And I have this set currently to plain white. I'm going to go ahead and just switch that over to the default, which typically works fairly well. But if we need the shadows to change a little bit or the environment to change, we might change the scene as we get closer to our final render. So this looks relatively good. It looks a little bit light in the preview window. So I can do one of two things. I can either change the appearance or I can make this a little bit darker. Because I like the way that a different appearance here reflects, I'm going to go into the painted, choose car, and pull out the black and drop it into the model. I like both the shade of black that they use for this as well as the illumination controls that are built in to that painted appearance. But pretty much either works. You can always modify those illumination controls to get just the right values. So I'm going to go ahead and just quickly take a look at a top view and see what we have. From the angled view, you can see that several items in here have a slightly different color. The large button, as well as the rubber scroll wheel. And this area here I'm going to assume is the same plastic as the rest of the remote. We can say the same about the buttons. They're probably about the same color. We might change them slightly to make them stand off a little bit more in a render. And the top button looks like it's a little bit more towards the matte side, maybe a medium gloss plastic. So we're going to go ahead and apply those out. So I'm going to come into the medium gloss plastic and simply drag and drop this onto that face. And I'll go ahead and zoom in a little bit closer so it's easier to see. Now this plastic is slightly less reflective than what appears in that picture. So I'm going to go ahead and modify that body. And just slightly turn up the reflectivity. I can see though at certain angles that this button does reflect quite a bit of white light. You can see in this angle it wouldn't quite look right. So before I modify that, let's get this set in the correct place so we know what the reflections are going to look like from the angle that we'll be using. One way to create a fairly realistic rendering is to actually have both sides of the model sit on the floor, which makes it look like it's simply sitting on a table or sitting on some sort of flat surface. And the shadows follow and look fairly natural. So I want to go ahead and create a quick sketch on the right plane, and we're going to create a floor plane based on the geometry in this model. So looking from the side, I want to place points at effectively the lowest points on each of these sides. And then I'm going to draw a line from one point to the other. And the reason I do it that way is it's quicker than having to produce the plane that would be parallel in the same direction. Now I have this face, and if I come into the scene and choose the align floor with option, I can choose out this face as the floor and then simply hide it away. Now if I come back in, I can go ahead and turn on perspective, and I can find a suitable angle for this rendering. So once again, it doesn't have to be exact. We want to get it fairly close as well as centered. So I would say that's roughly a good position to place this in. And I'm going to go ahead and hit the space bar and save out this view so that we can reuse it. But you can see there's a pretty vast difference between the way this button looks at this angle and the way it looks from the opposite angle. Because of the environment, it reflects white when faced in the opposite direction, and in this case it looks quite matte. So we can go back in and actually change the reflectivity a little bit so that we get the right look. Before I do that, this might be a good case to use the high gloss black and then simply modify the color. So if we come in and define a custom color, we can make this a bit darker and see how that looks. So I would say that looks about right. We might want to turn up the reflection amount so it's a little bit easier to see the button. And that probably too closely matches the surrounding material, so you can see it's sort of vanished. So I'm going to go ahead and just turn up the color a little bit on this. And I would say that looks about right. The next thing I want to do is define the power button color, or the power split lines color. So I have these two faces I can select and then change the color of their faces. And we can choose out whatever color we want. I think the darker red looks good. And from the render angle itself, it looks good as well, so we can leave it as is. The next thing I want to do is define the color for this body. We could change the appearance, but we can control most of this just from the illumination controls. So I'm going to go ahead and just apply this painted texture to that body so it can be modified. But there's quite a few appearances that would probably work in this case that we could modify. So I'm going to go ahead and turn down the reflection amount. And we'll also want to change the color to something a little bit brighter. And I can go ahead and compare it to this image. You can see this has slightly more of a matte look. So I might want to turn on the blurry reflections. And I would say overall that color looks good. It might be able to be a little bit darker with a higher reflection amount. But once again, not too important on the exact numbers. Next, I want to add an appearance for my scroll wheel. And for this we can use several kinds of rubber. I'll use a glossy rubber and apply it to the body. And then once again I'm going to compare this directly to that image. So once again this also looks a little bit more matte than what I have there. So let's go ahead and try out that matte rubber. And I would say that looks about right. It could be a little bit darker. So we'll just quickly come into the appearance. And rather than selecting the face, I do want the body. So I can come in and just choose that body. Once again, we're just going to make this slightly darker. And the three buttons in the back reflect fairly well, so I'm going to go ahead and leave the appearance as is. We'll just need to add decals to them. And then on these portions of the remote, I have several faces whose color I want to change. And these were just created using split lines. So I can go in and control click all three of these, or all four of these. And then edit the appearance of the face. For all of these, we don't need anything terribly complex. Just choose white, and those should look correct. And now I can go ahead and add the decals I have for this part.